I want to welcome you all to this video Drasha. This week's Torah portion is Emor. We're still reading in the book of Leviticus, and indeed, this week's Torah portion does deal with many topics having to do with the Kohanim, the priests. As we pointed out in last week's Drasha, the book of Leviticus, of course, focuses to a great extent on the rituals that took place in the temple in Jerusalem and the Kohanim and Levites who functioned there. Indeed, the English name of this book, Leviticus, contains the word Levite in it, and so it has to do with the Levites, and the Kohanim, the priests, were a subgroup of the tribe of Levi. But in this week's Torah portion, we also have one of two places where the Jewish calendar is laid out, the festival calendar. All of the holidays are listed with their dates. Now, if I were to ask you, or if someone were to stop and ask you, list for me the Jewish holidays. So how would we answer? Seems to me many of us would start with Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. We might start with the three festivals, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and then mention Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But we'd be leaving out of something very important, and that is the Sabbath. Indeed, the most important Jewish holiday comes once a week. And in today's Torah portion, with the list of the holidays, the very first one mentioned is the Sabbath. When we look at the Kiddush for Friday evening, we see that the Sabbath is called Zikaron Lema'aseh Bereshit. The Sabbath is referred to as a remembrance of the act of creation. And then it says Yom Tchila Lemikra'ei Kodesh. It is the first day of the holidays. It is the first day of the holy convocations. That's because in this week's Torah portion, where the holidays are listed, the very first one is the Sabbath. So we should keep that in mind, that really the most important holiday comes once a week. My favorite book, or one of my, I shouldn't say my favorite, but one of my favorite books is a book called The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man, by Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel was one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. Just to say a few words about Heschel, he was rescued from the Holocaust, actually by my alma mater, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, the Reform Rabbinical School, which actually rescued a number of prominent Jewish scholars by giving them jobs in Cincinnati so that they were able to get out of Europe and into the United States. So Heschel was one of these scholars that they brought to Cincinnati. He didn't last there too long because ultimately Heschel was a very traditional Jew. He was really a kind of Hasidic Jew who was very tied into the Hasidic way of life in Eastern Europe. But he was an unusual combination of a Hasidic Jew and also a PhD in philosophy. So he was a Chassid and a philosopher. But Heschel ended up teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He wrote many important books. He was also active in the civil rights movement. But this particular book, The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man, is a beautiful book that's short, less than 100 pages. It's very readable. And Heschel really discusses the importance of the Sabbath, and he brings up a concept which is very fundamental, and that is that there are two types of holiness. One is holiness of space, or we might say holiness of place. This is an idea which it's fairly easy for us to get our heads around. We can understand that a certain place is holy. Indeed, when Moses first encounters God at the burning bush, God tells him, "Take off your shoes. This is a holy place. It's holy ground." We refer to the land of Israel as the Holy Land, Jerusalem is a place of holiness. And indeed, the temple, which in Hebrew is called the Beit HaMikdash. Mikdash means a place of holiness. Mikdash contains in it the word kadosh, holy. And so it is a sanctuary, which, by the way, in English, sanctuary contains within it the word sanctus, which is the Latin word for holy. So the Mikdash is a place of holiness. We can also refer to a synagogue as a holy place. And indeed, one of the terms that's used for a synagogue is a mikdash ma'at, a little mikdash, a little sanctuary, a little temple. And indeed, that's why there are rules that govern what you can do and not do in a synagogue. There are rules that govern how one has to treat a building that is a synagogue. So we can get our heads around this idea of holiness in space, that there are places that are holy. That's why when one goes to Israel and you visit the Western Wall, there's a sense of mystery, of holiness about that place. People want to touch the stones of the Western Wall because there's some sense of holiness there. But Heschel says that in Judaism, the more important concept is the holiness of time. The recognition that not all time is the same, that some times are holy. Indeed, the very first instance of the word holy in the Torah is in the beginning of the book of Genesis, where we read that God created the world in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. And it says, and God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. That is the first instance of this word holy in the Torah, and it refers to the Sabbath. Indeed, the Sabbath was made holy by God. We can say, in a sense, that the holiness of the Sabbath is built into the creation of the universe. That's why when we get to the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, we're told in the commandment regarding the Sabbath, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The idea is the Sabbath day is holy. God sanctified it. The question is, are we going to keep it holy? Are we going to preserve that holiness? Now, there's another important concept and distinction, I think, as well. And that is there's a difference between the holiness of the Sabbath and the holiness of the festivals or the holidays. That's because, as we've just seen, the Sabbath was made holy by God. But the holidays, the festivals, ultimately are dependent to some extent for their holiness on the Jewish people. What do I mean by that? Well, in this week's Torah portion, we have the holidays listed and their dates. So we're told, for instance, that the 15th of the first month of the year is Passover. But the question is, how do I know when is the 15th day of the first month? The fact is, in ancient times, when the temple stood, the way that the calendar was established was that witnesses would come to Jerusalem, to the court which sat in Jerusalem, and they would testify that they had seen the new moon. And you needed at least 2 witnesses. The witnesses were examined by the court and to be sure that they were telling the truth. And then the court would declare, okay, this is the first of the month. Therefore, we count 15 days and we now know when Passover is. But the point here is that that is dependent on the Jewish court establishing when did the month begin. So ultimately, the holiness of the holidays is dependent in part on the Jewish people. Again, if we look at the Kiddush for Friday night, we see that the concluding line of the Kiddush says, Baruch atah Hashem, mekadesh HaShabbat. Blessed are you, O Lord, who sanctifies the Sabbath. When we look at the Kiddush for the festivals, for the evening Kiddush for the festivals, the final line, the concluding line, it says, Baruch atah Hashem mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, who sanctifies Israel and the times, meaning the holidays. Because ultimately God sanctifies Israel, the Jewish people. It is the Jewish people who establish the times, who establish the dates for of the holidays, who establish and so are in part responsible for the holiness of those holidays. When we talk about the holiday of Shavuot, which of course is approaching, that's the next holiday we're going to observe, which is Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of the Torah, we should note that the Torah, again in today's Torah portion, doesn't even mention the date of when the Shavuot occur. How do we know when Shavuot occurs? We start counting 7 weeks, 49 days, and the 50th day is Shavuot. So Shavuot is really doubly dependent on the Jewish people for its sanctity. Because just like all the other holidays, it's dependent on the court establishing the first day of the month, and then we counted 15 days, we got to Passover, and then the next day, the second day of Passover, we started counting 7 weeks, and then the 50th day is Shavuot. So Shavuot is dependent on the establishment of the new month, of the first month of the year, Nisan. But it's also dependent in another way, and that is, how do we know that we start counting on the second day of Passover? Actually, in this week's Torah portion, what it says is, on the day after the Sabbath, you should start counting 7 weeks. Well, how do we know that in this particular verse, the word Sabbath refers to Passover? That's because the oral Torah, the oral tradition that was interpreted by the rabbis, said that in this instance, the word Sabbath refers to the holiday of Passover. And that's how we know that on the day after Passover, meaning on the second day of Passover, we start counting these 7 weeks. So Shavuot is doubly dependent for its holiness on the Jewish people. First, because just like all holidays, the calendar was ultimately established by the court. And second of all, because even how we know when to start counting the 7 weeks was dependent upon the interpretation of the rabbis. By the way, I want to just note that, of course, today we have a fixed calendar. That fixed calendar was established already in the time of the Talmud. But before that, when the temple stood, the system of the calendar was established as I've explained it, with witnesses coming and testifying before the court. It is because of that, of course, that's why we have this whole concept that holidays are observed for 2 days outside of the land of Israel, and even Rosh Hashanah is observed for 2 days in the land of Israel. It has to do with uncertainties because of that way of establishing the dates of the month. But when we get back to this concept of Heschel's, of the holiness of time being more important than the holiness of space in Judaism, I think there are really 2 lessons that we learn from this, 2 things that we should mention. One, of course, is that the fact is that the holiness of time is something that we can take with us anywhere. You know, the holiness of place can only be appreciated really in that place. We have what we call we sometimes say about a joke, right? You had to be there, right? That's a location joke. You had to be there in order to get the joke. Well, the fact is, in order to really appreciate the holiness of a place, one has to be there. But the holiness of time is something that one can do anywhere. We can observe the Sabbath. We can observe the holidays anywhere that we happen to be. The other thing that we learn from this concept of the holiness of time is, I think, also about the holiness of life, about the sanctity of life. It's that if we appreciate that not all time is the same, if we appreciate that time itself can be holy, and we understand that our lives ultimately are lived in time. Our lives are a certain number of days, weeks, and months, and years. Ultimately, if we can appreciate the significance of time, if we can appreciate the holiness of time, I think that that also allows us to appreciate the holiness of life and to value the time that we have been allotted. I think what we need to appreciate is that every day of our lives is holy, is ultimately time that we need to treat seriously and with a sense of sanctity. And that concept of the holiness of time really informs us about the holiness of life. Again, I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos. We're all looking forward to the time when we'll be able to get back together to wish one another a good Shabbos in person, when we'll be able to gather together to daven together in the synagogue. We're all looking forward and hoping and praying for that day, and God willing, it'll get here soon. But for the time being, the most important thing is everyone needs to stay safe and stay healthy. Good Shabbos.